The winding road, a vein of cracked asphalt through a landscape Cole barely recognized, tightened its grip on my old sedan. Mist, heavy and smelling of brine and damp earth, clung to the evergreens, muting the already pallid afternoon light. Oakhaven, the name itself felt like a stone in my mouth, a place I'd consciously carved out of my memory for years, only to be dragged back by the brittle summons of a death certificate. Grandmother's final act, as cryptic and unyielding as her life had been. I pressed my foot down, the engine groaning in protest, eager to reach a destination I dreaded. The funeral was tomorrow, a quiet affair, the notice had read, hinting at the small fading community I knew Oakhaven to be. But even as the first weathered shingles of the outlying houses appeared through the haze, an unnatural quiet settled over me, a premonition that hummed beneath the rumble of the tires. The town square, usually a sleepy hub of muffled chatter and the occasional bark of a dog, was utterly silent. No children's laughter, no distant clang of a blacksmith, a relic of Oakhaven's past that had stubbornly endured for decades, not even the faint, rhythmic sigh of the ocean, which should have been audible from here. The air itself felt thick, not just with mist, but with an absence, a void where sound should have been. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white. This wasn't the Oakhaven I remembered, even in its most somber moods. I parked outside the old general store, a building that had stood sentinel for over a century. Its painted sign, faded to a ghost of its former self, creaked faintly in the non-existent breeze. The interior was dim, smelling of dust and forgotten things. Shelves lined with jars of preserves and tins of biscuits stood untouched, their labels yellowed with time. Behind the counter, a figure stirred. It was the shopkeeper, a man whose face, though lined with age, seemed eerily smooth, devoid of the usual crags and valleys of expression that years etch onto a person. His eyes, when they met mine, were a pale, watery blue, like stones at the bottom of a shallow creek. They seemed to look through me, rather than at me. "Cole," he said, his voice a flat murmur, utterly without inflection. No surprise, no recognition of the years that had passed, no condolences for my loss. "I'm here for my grandmother's funeral." He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Tomorrow, 2 o'clock, the Owl Chapel." His gaze drifted past my shoulder, fixing on some unseen point behind me. There was no warmth, no flicker of memory in his eyes, despite having known me since I was a boy. It was as if a part of him, the part that connected to the past, had simply dissolved. A shiver traced its way down my spine. As I left, the bell above the door still refused to announce my departure, leaving me with the distinct sensation that I hadn't truly been there at all. The feeling of being watched intensified as I drove through the narrow streets to my grandmother's house. The few townsfolk I saw were all cast from the same mold of quietude. They moved with a peculiar slowness, their steps measured, their faces uniformly blank. A woman tending a small garden paused, her trowel suspended mid-air, and simply stared at my car as it passed, her eyes reflecting the same vacant blue as the shopkeeper's. There was no curiosity, no annoyance, just an empty observation. It was unnerving. They seemed to exist in a state of perpetual calm, an unnatural placidity that felt more like absence than peace. My grandmother's house, perched on a slight rise overlooking the ocean, was a monument to neglect. Paint peeled from its clapboard, sighing like dry skin, and the porch sagged under the weight of accumulated dust and cobwebs. I needed to breathe, to feel something real. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and a vast, inky blackness had swallowed the sky. I walked the short, familiar path from the house, the crunch of gravel under my boots sounding like cannon fire in the stillness. Soon, the path opened onto the ocean shore at night with stationary waves. The scene before me was breathtaking and terrifying. The moonlight, usually a silver path across the water, seemed to illuminate only the surface, not penetrate it. The waves, which should have been crashing and roaring, were utterly still. They stood frozen, colossal glass sculptures caught mid-crest, their foamy tips suspended in impossible perpetuity. The air, usually alive with the salty spray and the mournful cries of gulls, was dead. It was as if the ocean itself had forgotten how to move, how to breathe. This wasn't just quiet, it was an active suppression, a fundamental alteration of reality. The sheer impossibility of it screamed through my mind, yet it was undeniably real. The stationary waves loomed, silent sentinels of an unimaginable stillness. I turned quickly, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, but there was nothing. Yet, the feeling persisted, a profound, unblinking scrutiny. I wasn't just being watched, I was being observed, analyzed, by something ancient and patient, something that had perhaps been watching Oakhaven for far longer than any living soul remembered. The town's silence wasn't empty. It was full, brimming with an unidentifiable presence that had claimed it. And now, it had claimed me too. The Undertaker's words, hollow and devoid of genuine sentiment, echoed in the stillness of the old chapel. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. The old chapel. His gaze had been a vacant landscape, a barren expanse where recognition should have bloomed. It was as if a part of him, the part that connected him to the vibrant tapestry of shared history, had simply frayed and dissolved into the thin Oakhaven air. The memory of his eyes, like polished river stones, lingered with a chill that morning. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of sunlight that pierced the gloom, illuminated like tiny, frantic ghosts. My grandmother, I thought, deserved more than this hushed, almost absent farewell. He had been a woman of fierce spirit, her laughter a bright, clanging bell, her stories a vibrant thread in the fabric of my youth. Now only a handful of faces dotted the pews behind me, each one a familiar contour, yet each one subtly altered, like a photograph left too long in the sun. After the brief, perfunctory service, as silence descended, thicker than any shroud, there were no tears, no shared anecdotes, no comforting murmurs, just a collective, almost unnatural quiet. I rose, my movements feeling amplified in the hushed space, and turned to face the sparse gathering. My gaze found the grocer, a man whose jowls had always quivered with hearty laughter, whose hands had once pressed sticky candies into my eager palm. "Ellie," I began, my voice a tentative ripple in the stillness. "It's Cole. I remember your stories about my grandmother's prize-winning roses. She always said you had the greenest thumb in Oakhaven." The grocer's eyes, once crinkled at the corners with mirth, now held a flat, unreadable quality. He nodded, a slow, almost mechanical gesture. "The roses," he repeated, his voice a low, gravelly hum. Yes, he had roses. There was no warmth in the recollection, no spark of shared memory. He offered no further detail, no anecdote about the specific crimson bloom my grandmother had so cherished. His eyes, though fixed on mine, seemed to look through me at some distant, invisible point. I pressed on, a knot tightening in my stomach. "Do you remember the year she won the county fair for them? I must have been 7, and she let me carry the ribbon." A flicker, perhaps, in his gaze, but it was quickly extinguished. "The fair," he mumbled, a faint frown creasing his brow. "A long time ago. That was." He shifted his weight, his hands clasped awkwardly before him. It was as if the details had been scrubbed away, leaving only a skeletal outline. My unease deepened. I moved to the woman who used to run this small bakery, her apron always dusted with flour, her smile a warm invitation. "Martha," I said, trying to infuse my voice with a hopeful familiarity. "It's Cole. I remember you teaching me how to braid dough for my grandmother's birthday strudel. She loved that strudel." Her eyes, usually bright and expressive, held a dull sheen. "Oh, Cole," he said, his voice soft, almost devoid of inflection. "Yes, the strudel. I remember your grandmother was fond of baked goods." She paused, her gaze drifting over my shoulder, then back. Did she? My grandmother had adored strudel, a fact as ingrained in my memory as the color of the sky. This was not a question one asked if they truly remembered. "Martha, of course she did," I replied, a strained smile on my face. "We made it every year." "Perhaps," she said, her voice trailing off. "My memory isn't what it used to be. Things blur sometimes." The air in the chapel felt suddenly heavy, pressing in on me. The few other attendees stood in a similar, quiet tableau, their faces bearing a strange, uniform placidity. There was no grief etched into their features, no shared sorrow, just a muted, almost serene acceptance. Their recollections, when I managed to coax them, were vague, generic, and unsettlingly consistent in their lack of specific detail. They spoke of my grandmother as if recalling a character from a long-forgotten story, not a vibrant, living woman who had been a cornerstone of their community for decades. The bright, sharp edges of my memories felt dull and soft, questioned by the blank stares and vague responses of those who should have shared them. Was I the one misremembering? Had my grief warped my perception, twisting cherished recollections into something they never were? The need to escape the suffocating quiet of the town, to clear the fog that seemed to be settling in my own head, became an urgent, almost desperate impulse. I found myself walking the familiar streets feeling alien beneath my feet, until the salt tang of the sea air finally reached me. The sight was arresting, deeply unsettling. The moon, a sliver of bone in the velvet sky, cast an ethereal glow upon the water. The waves, usually a restless symphony of crash and retreat, were unnaturally still. They stood frozen, mid-crest, like colossal, petrified sculptures, their foamy peaks arrested in an impossible moment. The sound of the ocean, usually a rhythmic pulse, was a muted sigh, barely audible, as if even the sea itself was holding its breath. The stillness was profound, a vast, silent testament to something profoundly wrong. It was a mirror to the town, to its people, whose memories now seemed fixed and unmoving, incapable of the ebb and flow of genuine recollection. I stood there, the cold wind biting at my exposed skin, but the chill that truly permeated me was born of a growing terror. The fixed waves, the fractured memories, the muted lives, they all pointed to a single, horrifying conclusion. Something was not just wrong in Oakhaven, something was slowly, inexorably, erasing it. And I was standing on the precipice of that erasure, my own sanity beginning to fray. The air in the chapel had been a leaden blanket, smothering. I had walked away from the muted gathering, their placid faces lingering in my mind like a half-forgotten dream. No tears, no whispered eulogies for my grandmother. Just that strange, uniform calm, a quietude that felt less like peace and more like an absence. The path back to my grandmother's house was lined with skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the twilight sky. The house itself loomed, a sentinel of weathered wood and shadowed windows, each pane reflecting the dying light like an unblinking eye. A faint, earthy scent clung to the porch, a mix of damp soil and something else, something ancient, like dust motes stirred from forgotten corners of time. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lavender and aged paper, a mausoleum of memories I barely shared. Now, in the wake of her cryptic passing, I was left to sift through the remnants of a life I knew little about. I started in the sitting room, a space crammed with ornate furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts awaiting resurrection. Each item I touched felt imbued with a strange gravity, as if holding secrets within its fibers. The ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall was the only sound, a relentless metronome counting down to some unseen hour. Hours bled into one another. I moved from room to room, opening drawers, sifting through yellowed photographs of faces I didn't recognize, and feeling a growing unease. There was an orderliness to the chaos, a meticulousness that spoke of a mind struggling to maintain control. In her study, a room dominated by towering bookshelves heavy with forgotten tomes, I paused. This was where she spent her final years, the silent sanctuary of her peculiar scholarship. I ran my hand along the spine of a leather-bound volume, the dust soft beneath my fingertips. Beneath a stack of innocuous financial ledgers, tucked away in a drawer with a cunning false bottom, my fingers brushed against something unexpected. It was a book, but unlike any I'd seen. Its cover was unadorned leather, worn smooth by countless touches, yet it had no title. Instead, a series of etched symbols, intricate and unfamiliar, spiraled across its surface like a forgotten language. My heart gave a sudden, jarring lurch. This felt different. This felt important. I carried it to the heavy oak desk, the scent of old paper and something metallic, like dried ink, rising from its pages. The binding was fragile, threatening to crumble under my touch. Opening it, I found no neat script, no gentle reminiscences. Instead, the pages were filled with a hurried, almost frantic scrawl, the ink often bleeding through the thin paper. The early entries were legible, if terse, observations on the weather, mundane household chores, interactions with a few townsfolk. But then, a shift. The handwriting grew erratic, the lines slanting wildly, soft at first, like the tide receding, but they steal more each time. A word, a name, a memory. My breath hitched, though forgetting. I turned a page, my fingers trembling slightly. They say it's old age. They say I'm confused, but I see it in their eyes. Ashamed, the uniform calm. They've forgotten the storms, the laughter, the sorrow. They've forgotten themselves. Interspersed with the frantic text were sketches of the same strange symbols from the cover, crude yet unsettlingly precise, like sigils. Some pages were entirely filled with them, a chaotic tapestry of lines and curves that seemed to writhe on the page. My grandmother's desperation bled from the ink. The founding not as they tell it. A bargain struck. A lineated bound. We were meant to watch, to guard, but the hunger it grows. It takes. It erases. My family's role. Oakhaven's founding. The journal was a testament to a mind unraveling. Yes, but also a mind fighting, desperately trying to hold on to something precious. My grandmother hadn't simply died. He had been consumed by this insidious forgetting. The air in the study felt suddenly thin, stifling. I needed air, needed to escape the suffocating weight of her final, frantic thoughts. I stumbled from the house, the journal clutched tight in my hand, and walked, almost blindly, until the scent of salt and seaweed filled my lungs. The moon, a sliver of silver in the ink-black sky, cast a weak, ethereal glow across the vast expanse of water. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant, mournful cry of a seabird. It was a beauty that felt alien, unsettling. Even here at the edge of the world, away from the suffocating house and the watchful, placid townsfolk, the stillness mirrored the town's strange, unnerving calm. It was a reflection of the emptiness my grandmother had fought against, an echo of the forgetting that threatened to swallow Oakhaven whole. The journal felt heavy, a leaden weight in my palm. It wasn't just the ravings of a lonely, old woman. It was a warning, and I, Cole, was now undeniably part of it. pulled into the legacy of a family secret that felt as ancient and unyielding as the ocean itself. The stillness of the waves, the quiet town, the forgotten history, they all converged into a single terrifying question: what exactly had Oakhaven forgotten? And what was it that remembered? My lungs burned with the effort of escape, a frantic flight from the suffocating truths trapped within my grandmother's journal. But the ocean here was not as I remembered. Its breath, usually a rhythmic exhalation and intake, was strangely muted. Waves, like frozen thoughts, held their crests just beyond the sand, a silent, unmoving testament to some unheard command. They were caught, suspended in an eternal pause, a visual echo of the fractured memories now haunting Oakhaven. The revelations within its covers had cracked open a door to something ancient, something that breathed beneath the very foundations of this town, and now, the frigid air felt charged with its presence. A delicate abrasion against the shell of my ear, like sand grains shifting on a drum's skin, made me flinch. It was not wind, nor the rustle of dry seaweed, not words, not yet, but the echo of meaning, a skeletal framework of language too vast, too old to be fully comprehended. I spun, scanning the desolate stretch of sand, the distant, silent line of the town's lights. Nothing, only the unmoving waves, the vast, indifferent night. It spoke of dissolution, of things unmade, of memories dissolving like sugar in tea. My grandmother's frantic scribblings, her warnings of a great forgetting, suddenly resonated with an unbearable clarity. This was it, wasn't it? The entities stirring, roused by my intrusion, or perhaps simply by the sheer audacity of remembering. A flicker, like a burnt match falling from my periphery, drew my gaze to the edge of the world. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again, forcing my vision to sharpen. Only the familiar, unsettling immobility of the ocean, yet the sensation of being watched, of being observed by something vast and patient, settled over me like a shroud. The town, when I finally forced my feet to carry me back towards its muted glow, felt different. Not just the usual Oakhaven strangeness, but a fresh layer of unsettling stillness. Each time I turned, they dissolved, leaving behind only the echoing certainty of their presence. The first subtle evidence of absence struck me near their old dockside tavern, a place that, despite Oakhaven's general somnolence, always held a flickering light and the murmur of low voices late into the night. A hastily scrawled sign, barely legible in the weak lamplight, simply read, "Closed." This was not the tavern keeper I knew. He had run the place for decades, a man as much a fixture of the dock as the barnacled pilings themselves. His scuffed boots, his booming laugh, the perpetual scent of stale ale and pipe tobacco that clung to him, all gone. I remembered his name, a simple, sturdy name, but when I tried to recall his face, it blurred, like a poorly developed photograph. A tremor ran through me. Tonight, the porch was bare, the windows were shuttered, and a for sale sign, pristine and unweathered, stood stiffly in the overgrown garden. It was as if the seamstress had never existed, her vibrant geraniums and sharp needles erased from the town's collective consciousness. I peered into the bakery window. The familiar, flour-dusted face of the baker, a man with kind eyes and a booming laugh, was absent. Instead, a younger woman, her face smooth and unfamiliar, moved with quiet efficiency behind the counter. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical. When I caught the eye of a colleague stocking shelves, I saw no recognition, no shed memory of the old baker. The colleague simply offered a placid, unblinking stare before turning back to his task. The pattern was terrifyingly clear. People were just disappearing. They were being unmade. Their spaces were filled, their absence unacknowledged, their very existence dissolving from the minds of those who remained. The entity wasn't merely taking, it was writing the very fabric of Oakhaven's reality. My grandmother's journal, now heavy and menacing in my hand, was not merely a record of her fears. It was a blueprint of the creeping erasure. I was a solitary island in a sea of encroaching oblivion, and the tide was rising. The journal, now tucked precariously inside my jacket, pulsed with a silent, terrible energy. It spoke of a creeping blight, a slow erasure, and pointed a trembling finger towards the old mill, an edifice of forgotten industry on Oakhaven's forgotten edge. Sleep was a distant shore I dared not reach. My mind, a frantic loom, wove together the journal's cryptic symbols with the unnerving uniformity of the townsfolk. Every vacant stare, every fractured memory, every unsettlingly synchronized gesture now clicked into a horrifying pattern. I had to go to the mill. The thought was a cold, sharp stone in my gut, yet I could not ignore it. The air grew heavier with each step away from the coastline, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something vaguely metallic and old. The paved roads gave way to a cracked asphalt path, then to a dirt track that wound through an overgrown thicket of gnarled oaks. Here, the silence was absolute, save for the rustle of my own hurried steps and the distant, mournful call of an unseen night bird. The mill emerged from the shroud of trees like a specter, a skeletal silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. Its once proud walls of gray stone were pockmarked and crumbling, their mortar long since surrendered to the persistent grip of moss and ivy. Broken window panes stared like vacant eyes, reflecting nothing but the dim, bruised light. A colossal wooden water wheel, its spokes splintered and rotten, hum suspended and motionless, a monument to a forgotten purpose. A gust of wind, sharp and sudden, whistled through a gaping hole where a loading bay door once stood. It was an invitation, or perhaps a warning. I pushed through a tangle of thorny bushes, my jacket snagging, and stepped onto the threshold. My flashlight beam, a hesitant spear, cut through the gloom, revealing a cathedral of disuse. Massive gears, their teeth encrusted with generations of grime, loomed like petrified beasts. Conveyor belts, frayed and torn, snaked across the floor, draped in thick shrouds of cobwebs that shivered in the faint breeze. I navigated the labyrinthine interior, my gaze sweeping across the rusted machinery, searching for anything that resembled the intricate symbols from the journal. My beam danced across a section of wall near what must have been the main grinding stone, now a hulking, inert mess. The stone itself was scarred and pitted, but the wall behind it, partially obscured by a cascade of fallen debris and a thick tapestry of mold, held something different. I knelt, pushing aside splintered wood and a crust of dried leaves. There, etched into the rough-hewn stone, were the carvings. They were crude, yet undeniably precise, a series of interlocking spirals and jagged lines that pulsed with a silent, malevolent energy. These were the very symbols that had haunted the margins of my grandmother's journal, symbols that hinted at something ancient, something predating Oakhaven itself. They felt less like writing and more like scars on the face of the world. As my fingers followed a particularly deep groove, a faint click echoed from the wall. I pulled back, startled, watching as a section of the stone, no wider than my shoulders, slowly, almost imperceptibly, receded inward. It wasn't a door, not in the conventional sense, but a perfectly camouflaged slat of rock sliding into a cavity, revealing a gaping blackness beyond. The carvings on the wall pulsed with a faint, almost imperceptible glow in the periphery of my vision, as if satisfied with their revelation. This was it. The journal had led me here, to this hidden artery beneath the mill, beneath Oakhaven. The vast expanse of the sea before me was a mirror to the void I felt inside, cold and indifferent. Flight was a primal urge, but a deeper, more insistent current pulled me back, a terrible magnetism drawing me toward the very heart of Oakhaven's rot. There was no escape from the truth, only a descent into it. I turned my back on the indifferent ocean, the taste of salt and fear on my tongue. The walk back through the hushed streets of Oakhaven was a blur of heightened senses. The few lights that pierced the gloom from behind drawn curtains felt like eyes, unblinking and vacant. I moved like a ghost among ghosts, a living trespasser in a town slowly forgetting how to live. My destination was the forgotten entrance beneath the old mill, a place I'd stumbled upon in my youth, now imbued with a sinister significance. The mill stood like a skeletal sentinel against the moonless sky, its broken windows like empty sockets. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, a smell that had clung to the journal's brittle pages. A gust of stale, subterranean air, thick with the odor of wet stone and something else, something vaguely organic and profoundly ancient, washed over me. I hesitated for only a breath, then plunged into the maw. The passage was a narrow, rough-hewn tunnel, barely wide enough for my shoulders. The stone walls, slick with a perpetual dampness, scraped against my jacket as I squeezed through. Each step echoed, amplified and distorted by the confined space, a mocking chorus to my apprehension. My breath plumed in the beam of the flashlight, a transient fog against the eternal stone. I felt the earth's immense weight above me, a crushing presence that threatened to collapse my resolve. The tunnel twisted and turned, a labyrinthine path carved by unknown hands for unknown purposes. My sense of direction dissolved, replaced by a primal instinct to simply keep moving forward. Eventually, the passage widened, then opened abruptly into a cavernous chamber. On the rough-hewn walls, barely visible beneath a layer of grime and mineral deposits, I saw them. Crude carvings, not images, but symbols, intricate spirals, interlocking lines, and glyphs that seemed to writhe and contort under my gaze. They weren't decorative, they felt like instructions, or perhaps a language beyond human comprehension. Below them, arranged in unsettling patterns on the damp earth floor, were bones. Not neatly interred, but scattered, some gnawed, others meticulously placed in concentric circles. They were large, too large for any local wildlife I knew, their surfaces smooth and gray with age. As I ventured deeper into the chamber, the air began to hum, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very soles of my boots. It wasn't a mechanical sound, but something deeper, more organic, like the sustained note of an impossibly vast instrument. My flashlight beam, now trembling in my hand, found its source. Against the far wall, nestled in a recessed alcove, was a growth. At pulse, a grotesque, bulbous mass, unlike anything I had ever seen. It was the color of bruised plums and wet ash, with tendrils that snaked outwards, disappearing into cracks in the stone. With each slow, deliberate throb, a faint, sickly luminescence emanated from its core, casting a shifting, purple-tinged glow on the carved symbols and ancient bones around it. It was undeniably real. This was the feeder, the anchor, the thing that drew sustenance from Oakhaven's fading memories. A wave of nausea washed over me, a profound revulsion that threatened to buckle my knees. I imagined it reaching, searching, tasting the fear and confusion that now churned within my mind. I was no longer just an observer. I was here in its presence, a fresh source of something it might crave, and I was trapped with it, deep beneath the forgotten town. The journal, clutched in my numb fingers, had whispered of a place, a deep, forgotten artery beneath Oakhaven, a site of communion. I had fled the crushing weight of those pages, but now, a strange, undeniable current pulled me inland, away from the vast, indifferent sea, toward the town's ancient heart. No crickets chirped, no distant dog barked. The entrance to the caverns was a jagged maw, half hidden by a curtain of gnarled ivy. It looked less like a natural formation and more like a wound in the earth, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. A raw, subterranean breath, cool and laden with mineral tang, sighed out from its depths. But the journal's words, the collective mind, pulsed in my memory, a siren call to the truth, however monstrous. I pushed through the clinging vines, the stones scraping against my coat. The passage narrowed immediately, a tight squeeze through rough-hewn rock. The descent was steep, the air growing heavier, pressing on my chest. My breath hitched. Before me, illuminated by an inexplicable, faint phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from the very stone itself, stood a gathering. Dozens of them, townsfolk. The librarian, her usually severe buns slightly askew, the quiet fisherman from the docks, his weathered face smooth, serene. Even the stout baker, his hands usually dusted with flour, now hung limp at his sides. They stood in concentric circles, their bodies swaying with an unnerving, synchronized rhythm like kelp in a slow, unseen current. Their eyes, they were open, yet utterly vacant, glazed over with an inward focus. No flicker of recognition, no spark of individual thought. Just an endless, unseeing gaze. Their lips moved, but no distinct words emerged. It was the sound of 1,000 forgotten memories, of fragmented emotions, sighing into existence. What was this? It was precisely what the journal had hinted at. Yet the reality was 100 times more horrifying. They weren't talking to each other. They were speaking as one, or perhaps to something. A deep, pervasive hunger settled in the air, not for food, but for something far more intimate, far more fundamental. They were feeding it, unknowingly. Their fragmented memories, their emotions, their very selves were being siphoned away, coalescing into that central, silent presence. This was the collective mind. Not a shared consciousness of individuals, but a vast, consuming entity that was slowly, meticulously assimilating Oakhaven, erasing its inhabitants into a single, vast, undifferentiated consciousness. They were becoming threads in a colossal, silent tapestry, their individual patterns dissolving into the whole. A strange warmth began to bloom in my own chest, spreading outwards, a gentle, insidious coaxing to simply let go. My grandmother's face, etched with worry, flickered in my mind, then began to blur, her features softening, becoming indistinct. My gaze drifted to the face of the old fisherman. His eyes, though vacant, held a faint, lingering echo of peace. A profound, terrifying peace. It beckoned me, a silent invitation to join the vast, silent consciousness, to become one with Oakhaven's fading heart. The pull was immense, a psychological undertow threatening to drag me under. My memories, my identity, felt suddenly fragile, like sand castles against a rising tide. To forget, to be forgotten, to simply be. And for a horrifying, fleeting moment, it felt like the most beautiful offer I had ever received. My fingers, numb around the leather-bound journal, felt the chill of its age, a cold comfort against the encroaching void. A peculiar drowsiness, not born of fatigue, began to steal over me. It was a sweet, insidious invitation, a velvet curtain unfurling behind my eyes. I felt a yearning to simply let go, to sink into the vast, silent consciousness that had swallowed Oakhaven whole. The individual threads of memory that wove the tapestry of coal of me felt loose, ready to unravel and restitch themselves into a larger, more harmonious pattern. It was a seduction, a siren song sung not with sound, but with an overwhelming sense of belonging. The scent of salt and decay, once sharp, now smoothed into a pleasant, earthy perfume. I felt my grip on the journal slacken, my muscles taut with days of fear and discovery, began to relax, surrendering to the profound peace that threatened to dissolve me. My grandmother's careful script, detailing the entity's nature, its slow, consuming hunger, seemed distant, an echo from a life I was already forgetting. No, the thought was a shard of ice, piercing the warm, enveloping fog. My grandmother, her death. It was an anchor, tiny but unyielding. I forced my eyes open, though the effort felt monumental, like lifting a stone from the seabed. The stationary waves of the ocean, frozen in their eternal, silent crash, seemed to pulse with an internal light, drawing me further into their glassy depths. I could feel the entity's tendrils, not physical, but threads of thought, of feeling, gently tugging at the core of my being, inviting me to shed the burden of individuality. To be one, to be nothing. A guttural sound, half sob, half growl, tore from my throat. It was a sound of defiance, ugly and raw. Away from the hypnotic gaze of the ocean, away from the unseen heart of Oakhaven that pulsed with this collective consciousness. My legs, heavy with a reluctance that was not my own, obeyed with agonizing slowness. Each step away from the water was a monumental victory, a wrenching free. I ran, not fast, but with a desperate, clumsy urgency, through the overgrown paths, the skeletal trees, until the familiar, albeit unsettling, silhouette of my grandmother's house appeared. I collapsed onto the worn rug in the living room, the journal falling open beside me. It did not kill. It did not destroy in the conventional sense. It assimilated. It absorbed. It erased. Oakhaven wasn't being destroyed. It was being unmade. Its inhabitants weren't dying. They were dissolving into a collective memory, their unique lives becoming mere fragments in a vast, shared dream. My grandmother hadn't been murdered. He had been resisting, and her mind, her memories, had been slowly consumed, leaving only a shell. But with this terrifying understanding came a fierce, unyielding resolve. I had felt its pull, had almost succumbed. I knew its lure, its insidious method, and I had resisted. That, I realized, was the first step towards fighting it. I picked up the journal, its pages now feeling less like a burden and more like a weapon. My grandmother's frantic, yet meticulous, entries suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. Her notes on resonance, dissonance, and severing the thread were not the ramblings of a woman losing her mind, but the desperate research of someone trying to understand and combat an unimaginable threat. Her diagrams, crude but precise, showed a network of subtle connections, like roots beneath the town, all leading to the site of communion. She hadn't found a way to destroy the entity. He had explored methods to disrupt it, to sever its connection to the collective memory it fed upon. There was a specific frequency, an ancient symbol, a particular resonance he had theorized could create a profound dissonance, a psychic shockwave that might temporarily break the entity's hold. It wasn't about killing it. It was about cutting off its sustenance, isolating it, perhaps even forcing it into a dormant state. My fingers traced a specific diagram, a complex arrangement of lines and circles accompanied by a single, underlined word, fracture. The stakes were no longer just Oakhaven, but the very concept of individual identity within it. I would use her research, her final, defiant act of defiance to fight back. The path was perilous, unknown, but as I looked at the intricate patterns of her last, most vital work, a grim determination settled within me. I was shaken, yes, but no longer lost. I had a plan, and I would see it through. I fought. The thought was a shard of ice, piercing the warm, enveloping fog. It was a rebellion, a desperate spark against the gathering darkness. My grandmother, her death. It was an anchor, tiny but unyielding, a thread pulling me back from the gray current. The journal felt heavy in my hand, its leather cover worn smooth by countless years of grandmother's touch. It was my last tether to clarity, to the truth he had guarded. Faces, once etched with individual histories, blurred into a uniform placidity, eyes wide and unnervingly still. Time itself seemed to thicken, each passing moment a viscous, slow drip. I found the old ferryman first, hunched by the derelict dock, his gnarled hands idly tracing patterns in the grimy planking. His boat, the Seagull Asterisk, lay half submerged, a ghost of its former self. "Herman," I said, my voice too loud in the unnatural quiet. He didn't stir. "Herman, remember the storm of '98, the one that nearly took the lighthouse? You saved those 2 children, remember?" His head tilted fractionally, a slow, deliberate movement. His gaze, when it met mine, was like a reflection in still water, deep, but showing nothing of the world beyond its surface. A faint tremor passed through his lips, a soundless whisper. For a fleeting second I saw a flicker, a spark of the fierce, weathered man I remembered, a glint of fear, or perhaps recognition, in the depths of his eyes. Then, it was gone, subsumed by the pervasive calm. He blinked, a slow, methodical action, and returned to his silent drawing. My hope! A fragile thing, fractured. The air itself felt heavy, laden with the weight of unspoken, unremembered things. The journal called to me, its pages promising answers. I walked until the last skeletal streetlights faded behind me, the only illumination the anemic moonlight. It was a bizarre, unsettling sight. The tide, usually a restless breath, lay frozen, each wave a glass-signed sculpture caught mid-crest, reflecting the anemic moonlight without motion. A silent, impossible shore. The usual roar and hiss of the sea were absent, replaced by a profound, suffocating quiet. Even the gulls were gone, their cries erased from the night. My grandmother's script, usually elegant and precise, grew more frantic in the later entries, words slanting, sometimes overlapping. It feeds on the vibrant hum on the tapestry woven by countless lives. To disrupt its consumption, one must not merely remember, but remember, to piece together what has been torn asunder. Not a single thread, but the whole cloth. The luminous echo. It is not a thing, but an act. A collective song of the forgotten. It requires the confluence of the oldest memories, those rooted deepest in the soil and the stone, those that sing of beginnings. The heart of the current, where the ocean stills its voice, there the true memory waits, a beacon against the gray. The key is not an object, but a resonance. It must be struck when the moon is full and the tide is held in its unnatural slumber. The words swam. This was the place. This impossible stillness was not merely a symptom, but perhaps a stage, a threshold. And the key, a resonance, not an object. It was a specific act of collective remembering, a resonance of shared history. I closed the journal, its wisdom now a heavy weight in my hands. It wasn't enough for me to simply know I needed others. I needed to find those whose memories were not yet entirely consumed, those who still held a flicker of their former selves. The task felt insurmountable, like trying to gather dust in a hurricane. But the alternative, Oakhaven, and perhaps myself fading into a silent, forgotten echo, was unthinkable. The clock was not just ticking, it felt as though its gears were already grinding to a halt. My breath hitched, a cold tremor running through me despite the unseasonable warmth of the night. The water, a flat obsidian mirror, stretched out, undisturbed by the usual ebb and flow. It was here. It had to be. My gaze traced the still surface, searching for an aberration, a sign, anything. Then, a subtle shift, not in the water itself, but beneath it. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer, a distortion in the moon's reflection, like heat rising from an unseen vent. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic throb that I felt more in my teeth than heard with my ears. Driven by a resolve that felt both alien and utterly my own, I waded into the silent current. The water was colder than it looked, an icy clasp around my ankles, then my calves. With each step, the shimmering grew more defined, coalescing into a spectral luminescence just below the surface. My boots found purchase on something solid, slick and unyielding, a submerged causeway leading into the depths where the light now pulsed with an undeniable, beckoning rhythm. The air grew dense, the pressure in my ears building. I was moving into the earth's maw, guided by an unseen hand towards the source of Oakhaven's creeping malady. The tunnel, for that's what it became, was not carved but grown, its walls smooth and cool, occasionally punctuated by strange, organic nodes that glowed with the same faint, internal light. These were not mere stones. They were veins. The air here was still and heavy, devoid of any natural breeze. My eyes struggled to adjust, then widened in horrified comprehension. Before me, dominating the vast space, was the entity. It was not what I had imagined, not a beast of tooth and claw, nor a spectral horror. It was soft, almost gelatinous in appearance, yet radiated an immense, ancient power that made my knees tremble. Within its undulating form, I saw them. Memories, not mine, but millions. Fragmented, swirling, forming, and dissolving like smoke. They were not just images, they were feelings, raw and potent, washing over me in waves. This was the luminous echo, the heart of the current. It was absorbing Oakhaven, not with violence, but with a slow, insidious embrace, turning individual lives into mere echoes within its colossal, silent mind. And I was standing before it, a single, solitary voice in a world of muted echoes. My determination, which had propelled me through the town's unsettling quiet, now felt like a flickering candle in a hurricane. How could I fight this? It was not a physical foe. It was pure essence, pure memory, pure absorption. Yet I had to try, for my grandmother, for the Oakhaven that was a Oakhaven that could be again. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the air thick with the entity's presence. I reached out, not with my hand, but with my mind, focusing on my own memories. My grandmother's laugh, the scent of her rose garden, the feel of her hand in mine. Small, individual moments, vibrant and defiant against the overwhelming tide of collective oblivion. The entity responded. A wave of shimmering light pulsed outwards, striking me with an intensity that threatened to unravel my very being. I saw myself as a stranger, a distant relative, a forgotten name. My own memories began to blur, to merge with the vast ancient stream. I saw myself falling into the ocean, dissolving into the stationary waves, becoming one with the luminous echo. My name, Cole, felt alien on my tongue, a sound without meaning. A desperate, guttural cry tore from my throat. This was the struggle, not of muscle against sinew, but of will against an ancient, hungry mind. I fought back, clenching my fists, digging my heels into the damp ground. I called upon every memory that defined me. The sting of first heartbreak, the exhilaration of a childhood triumph, the quiet comfort of my own thoughts. I forced them to the forefront, a shield against the encroaching tide. The cavern vibrated, the light and shadow of the entities swirling with increased fervor. It was a song, yes, but a deafening one, a chorus of forgotten voices trying to drown out my single defiant note. They was I Cole, or Millie, another echo, another forgotten Mary in the entity's eternal hum. The fear was not of death, but of erasure, of ceasing to be myself. You won't have Oakhaven. I envisioned a disruption, a crack in its vast, silent consciousness, a single, discordant note in its collective song. I poured all my individual will, all my remembered self, into that imagined fissure, a desperate, brutal act of mental defiance against the luminous echo. The entity pulsed violently, its light flaring, then dimming as if in pain. The struggle had truly begun. The water before me was a vast, unblemished mirror, reflecting the pale, indifferent moon. No ripple, no whisper of tide, just an expanse of liquid obsidian, utterly silent, utterly still. This tranquil surface, this profound absence of motion, was the membrane between Oakhaven and the entity that had slowly, insidiously devoured its essence. It was the silent throat through which the town's collective memory had been siphoned, leaving behind the hollowed echoes of humanity. I had sought the truth, and now it lay before me, demanding an impossible act. How does one sever a consciousness that has become the very fabric of a place? I could feel the latent hum beneath the water's surface, a vibration not of sound, but of pure, absorbed thought, a vast, patient hunger. The stationary waves seemed to hold their breath, weighing. A single, desperate thought formed. Break it. Break the stillness. Break the connection. I plunged my hands into the water, not gently, but with a sudden, violent force tearing at the surface. The mirror shattered, not into glass, but into 1,000 fractured reflections of the moon, swirling and reforming. I thrashed, splashing, my movements clumsy and inelegant, a defiant, singular disruption against the vast, patient absorption. A profound, resonant shock ripped through me. It was not a sound I heard with my ears, but a shriek felt deep within my bones, a collective scream of absence. The water recoiled, not in waves, but in a sudden, violent surge that tasted of brine and something anciently bitter. My head swam, a dizzying onslaught of fragmented images that were not my own, a child's forgotten lullaby, the scent of a long-lost bakery, the rough texture of a fisherman's net. It was the entity's death throes, a psychic discharge, a torrent of stolen lifeblood returning to the ether, raw and unmoored. I stumbled back from the shore, gasping, my lungs burning. Small, restless waves now lapped at the sand, a tentative, almost hesitant sound. The first thing I noticed was the light, or rather, the lack of it. Before, the town had glowed with a uniform, placid luminescence, a reflection of its unified, muted consciousness. Others flickered with uncertain, internal lights. He stood in the street, his head tilted, his eyes wide and unfocused. He looked lost, like a man waking from a dream he couldn't quite recall. But what was I doing? He murmured, his voice raspy, alien. He reached a hand at his forehead, then let it fall, his gaze sweeping across the deserted street as if seeing it for the first time. My name, I think it's. I sell things, don't I? His voice was a blend of confusion and a nascent, terrifying awareness. Further down, I saw a woman, a baker, sitting on her stoop, clutching a flour-dusted rolling pin. He loved the little boats, but his face. The entity had been disrupted, yes, but the memories, like shattered fragments of glass, had not all reassembled. Some were gone, forever erased, leaving gaping wounds in the minds of Oakhaven's inhabitants. The uniformity was broken, but in its place was not restoration, but pervasive, agonizing confusion. People wandered aimlessly, their eyes searching, their murmurs a discordant chorus of incomplete thoughts and fractured recollections. A palpable sense of trauma hung in the salty air, a collective psychic wound. This was the cost, this was the victory. Oakhaven was irrevocably scarred, a town of ghosts still living, haunted by the echoes of what they had forgotten. It was a mistake, some pieces returned, others forever lost, leaving a jagged, incomplete picture. My own mind felt strangely clear, yet also profoundly weary. as if I had carried the burden of all their lost memories for a time. I could leave, or I could stay. Stay and try to help piece together what remained, to build something new from the wreckage of their collective past, knowing that some parts would always be missing. The choice hung in the air heavy and I, Cole, was left with the echoes of that terrible song, a silent consciousness that had nearly claimed me, and a choice that would define the rest of my days.